Welcome to Darasa Online. With you today is Saleh Yasin with the history subject. The topic which we shall start today is colonial administrative systems. It is a Form 3 topic with a number of subtopics that are direct role, indirect role, assimilation policy, association policy, and lastly will be colonial military and colonial legal institutions. However, for today, we shall base our discussion on only two subtopics that are direct rule and indirect rule. The specific objectives that our expectations that at the end of this topic you would have acquired the knowledge about at the end of the subtopic you would have acquired the knowledge to answer a few questions after. We shall base on the following specific objectives: explaining the concepts of direct rule and indirect rule, appraising the motives for the application of direct rule and indirect rule, analyzing the similarities and differences of direct rule and indirect rule. Then, after the lesson, we shall make a reflection on how much we have understood the basics or the main themes in the lesson of today. We shall go through a number of questions that will be examined, that will be put forward to you, and expect that you would follow me and be in a position to answer the questions. At the end of the lesson, our questions shall be indirect rule and direct rule were same systems with different names. Substantiate this statement by giving 6 points. Question 2 is indirect rule policy was truly indirect. Justify the validity of this statement by giving 6 points. Then we start with the first subtopic, and that is direct rule policy of administration. But before we go directly to explaining what this system of administration was, let us have an understanding of what these colonial administrative systems were. What do we mean by the colonial administrative systems? You will see that there were political mechanisms that were applied or designed by the colonial masters for easy and systematic control of their colonial subjects. There were policy mechanisms that the colonial masters put forward for easy control of his colonial subjects or management of the colonies. These policies varied from one colonial master to another, depending on prevailing circumstances the colonial master found in the colony and the attitude that the colonial master had towards the colonized people. When we talk of the different mechanisms that were applied by the colonial masters in the governance of their colonies, that is, the different administrative policies, rather I can call them systems, that were applied by the colonial masters in governing their colonies. That one doesn't mean that the colonial master had divergent agenda or interest in the colonies. He had one agenda, and that is subjugating the colonized people and exploiting the available resources in the colonies. So, though the colonial masters used different approaches in the governance of their colonies, their agenda was one, was to see how the system they applied would help them in easy subjugation, in the easy control of the colonial subjects, so that the resources in that particular colony could be easily exploited. That signifies that the colonial systems introduced in the colonies by the colonial masters were to serve the colonial interests and not the colonized. The colonial master introduced systems that only benefited him. Thus, the interest of the colonizer was to serve the colonizer and not the colonized people. So, after wars of conquest, after subjugating African societies, after quelling all African resistances, the colonial master had to settle to see on how best he could administer the colonies. That is when these administrative systems were introduced. Conquest over, then see how to settle and exploit resources by easy management of the colonized people. Make them help the colonial master exploit the resources available. There were mainly 4 administrative systems that were applied by the colonial masters in their colonies. And these are we have number 1, and that is direct rule, applied mainly by the Germans, Belgians, and the Portuguese. Then 2, indirect rule, mainly by the British, was assimilation, mainly by the French, but also to a lesser extent by the Portuguese. And 4 was association by the French after failure of assimilation. These are our the major colonial systems of administration that were applied by the colonial masters in their different colonies. We shall begin straightforward by looking at direct rule. What was this policy of direct rule, and what can you relate it to a system of administration applied today? It was a form of colonial administrative system by which power was concentrated in the hands of the European colonial officials. That it involved the establishment of a highly centralized foreign authority within the colony, which was run by the colonial officials. Being a highly dictatorial form of administration, direct rule did not respect African institutions. All power was concentrated in the hands of the colonial officials. The local chiefs, the local rulers, could be given some little powers, but under extreme supervision and follow-up of the colonial masters, the colonial officials. The system pushed the local chiefs to the lowest level of colonial government, and the natives were considered not as citizens, but merely as objects of exploitation, and were extremely harassed. The system was brutal by then. The laws, of course, were made in the metropolitan states, and the colonial masters had only one thing in mind, that is utmost economic exploitation of the colonies. So the colonial masters were really brutal in the administration of their colonial subjects. They suppressed all possible African institutions that they deemed were necessary or could limit their exploitative tendency or agenda in the colonies. Today, in the present world, students, listeners, what can you compare this administration to? Of course, you'll compare it to an outright dictatorial system of governance, where the rulers do not respect the rights of the ruled. The rulers have no mind of respect and consideration of the demands and rights of their subjects. In this map, you can see here that we try to see the colonial map of by 1914. Why are we interested in 1914? In 1914, it's when the colonial masters had cleared all African resistances. They had quelled all possible African primary and secondary resistances that happened to occur during the colonial inception. By 1914, we are saying the colonial master now started to settle and see forward how to administer the colonies to reap what he had come for, exploitation of the resources. On the map, you can see in this maroon color are the British colonies. The British colonies. You can see from southern, the Union of South Africa to Egypt, except that they were blocked by the Germans who conquered Tanganyika, or the German East Africa. Then in cream are the German colonies. So you can see where the British applied indirect rule, though in some colonies it was not applied. We shall see. We have said the systems were applied according to the prevailing circumstances. That means that there are colonies like the Southern Rhodesia. The British never applied indirect rule because it could not have them there. Then also we have the German colonies. We have the German East Africa, Southwest Africa, Cameroon and Togoland. Then we have the French colonies. You can see them. Most of their colonies were in West and some in Central Africa. You can see them there. From North Africa, the largest part of West Africa, and parts of Central Africa, where we have countries like Chad and Central African Republic today. Then the French Equatorial Africa, which came to form the countries of Gabon and Congo Brazzaville. Then we have the Italian colonies. We have Libya there and parts of Somalia and Eritrea. We have Portuguese colonies, Angola, Mozambique. Then we have Guinea and those islands of the Atlantic Ocean. Then Guinea is there, which is now called Guinea-Bissau, Spanish, and some independent colonies that were not colonized. What could be the reasons for the application of direct rule by the Germans, the Portuguese, and the Belgians? The reasons for the application of direct rule in some colonies by some colonial masters. One and foremost was lack of past experience of colonial governance. For example, German and Belgium that had never participated in the colonization before. By the time the German came to colonize Africa, they had just achieved their unification. Germany then was a new country with no experience of foreign policy, especially foreign policy beyond Europe. Colonization in Africa was their first experience of colonial system. The same with the Belgians. The Belgians had never participated in colonization. So these two colonial masters had no any other system in mind but direct rule. Remember that even the colonial masters like the British and the French, who had a long time colonial experience, had first applied direct rule in their first colonial experience in the Americas. So the Germans and the Belgians had to follow the same route because they had no any other system in mind. Then two, need for quick effective exploitation. It was seen that involving Africans, more Africans in administration, was seen as a wastage of time and funds. These powers had an agenda to develop the colonies through African partnership, but exploited them. The Germans, the Portuguese, the French saw that involving Africans would waste their time and resources, because it would mean training African administrators and then equip them with all the necessary equipments for administration. To them, then, this would delay the exploitation process of the colonies. There was the feelings of racial superiority. The Germans, the Portuguese, and the Belgians felt so highly civilized than any other races in the world, especially the Germans. To them, therefore, the colonial subjects had nothing to contribute towards administration, but only be used as objects of labor. Nothing other than that. There was mistrust over the Africans. The colonial masters that applied direct rule fear that African chiefs, if involved in administration, would have influence to organize resistances against the European rule. They did not have trust. They did not have the skills to make Africans serve as their partners. They saw them as the people who would oppose colonial rule. They did not have that trust. They believed that when Africans would be involved in administration, would inspire, the African chiefs would inspire their subjects to resist colonial rule. That is why they could not give them position in administration. There was a question of high population and unemployment. Belgium and Portugal are small countries. I don't know how many times can Portugal, Belgium enter into the Tanzania territory. More than 20 times. So this one meant that with the small size of their countries and high population, they experienced high unemployment problem. You remember, Belgium is, since those days, is among the most industrialized countries in Europe. They experienced a high unemployment problem. So they wanted to offload a large part of the unemployed people in Europe to be transferred into the colonies and be employed in different sectors, including administration. So using indirect rule was a means to have employment unemployed people. The possession of few colonies. Germans had few colonies, the Portuguese the same, and Belgians. I'll give an example. The German had the German East Africa, they had Togoland, they had the German South West Africa, now Namibia, and they had Cameroon. The Portuguese had the colonies of Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, and Guinea-Bissau. And Belgium had only one colony known as the Belgian Congo, known as today as an independent country of the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the former Zaire. So this possession of few colonies meant that they had enough manpower to administer all their colonies. Unlike their counterparts, the British and the French, who had many colonies. The British had something like 16 colonies. It means that they needed the African chiefs to help them in the administration. Unlike these ones, with a few colonies, could man their colonies by themselves. Having seen indirect rule, now I see that we shall come back to it when we are comparing with the British indirect rule. So let us see indirect rule. What was indirect rule, and what can you compare it with present governance situation? The system, also referred to as conjunctive administration, was a policy mostly applied by the British and used traditional authorities in colonial administration in an inferior role. The system meant Africans had to be ruled through their local rulers, who served as agents through whom the British demands of colonial rule would be achieved. In theory, it meant respect of traditional authorities and giving them or retaining their administrative powers. That is, to let the ruled rule the ruled with respect of their position as long as they serve the British interests. It meant that Africans would retain their powers at a minimal or lower level. Like other administrative systems, the colonial masters made all rules, and the work of the colonial chief was to implement the orders of the colonial masters. Rules were made from the colonial office in London and then passed to the colonies for implementation. In this one, you see that at the top of administration was the colonial officer, and who was giving orders that were descended on him from the colonial office. And the orders were passed through a systematic chain of command to the local chief, whose work now was to implement the orders given by his master, the European officer. The policy was a brainchild of Captain Frederick Lugard, the first governor of the Protectorate of Nigeria, who adopted the system from his administrative experience in India. From India, Lugard was transferred to Africa, and his first post as an administrator was in Nigeria. So when he arrived in Nigeria and looking at the prevailing circumstances, the condition on the ground in Nigeria, he compared them with India and saw that he would use the same systems that the British were applying in India to govern the British colonial subjects in Africa. Remember that India, where the British had their rule for many years before the colonization of Africa, was always used as a political laboratory for British administration or colonial administration. They could experiment a system in India. If it worked, then the same system was transferred to their other colonies, including African colonies. So when Lugard arrived in northern Nigeria, he found a more centralized administrative system among the Fulani and the Hausa. The Fulani had the caliphate system, which was more centralized. So he thought that the indirect rule would be more successful in Africa by looking at the situation in northern Nigeria. Though the British were fond of indirect rule, it was not successful everywhere. It worked well in northern Nigeria, not the whole of Nigeria, but northern Nigeria, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Tanganyika, when the German East Africa was mandated to them by the League of Nations after the First World War. In some colonies where indirect rule proved impossible, the British changed to direct rule. In the beginning, I said the system of administrations were applied by different colonial masters in their different colonies, depending on the prevailing circumstances, the environment that the colonial master met in the colony, and the attitude that he held over those colonial subjects. So in some areas, the British did not force an indirect rule system, and where it was not applicable to them, they changed to direct rule. In southern Nigeria, that is eastern and western Nigeria, and then in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, we remember they met stiff resistance by the Africans, like the Ndebele resistance and the Chimurenga resistances, which they had to quell by using a lot of force. And we know the Ndebele were resistant from the start of colonial rule to the end. They never wanted to cooperate with the British. On the map here, we see the map showing former British colonies. I'll point to you where indirect rule was more successful. It is true that the British tried it in most of their colonies, but there are colonies where it was more successful. And those were, we have Nigeria, we have Uganda, Tanganyika when it was given to them, and Sierra Leone. There it worked for them. In other colonies, also in Nyasaland, now Malawi, it worked well, and somehow in Zambia, former Northern Rhodesia. In other colonies, it failed, especially Southern Nigeria, Southern Rhodesia, and somehow in Kenya. Reasons for the application of indirect rule by the British. Listeners, dear students, and all those who are listening or watching, let us try to divert our attention now to the reasons for the application of indirect rule. What reasons did they see that indirect rule was a better form of administration than other forms like direct rule and assimilation? 1. Inadequate manpower. The British had many colonies, about 16 in number, so could not raise enough European administrators to effectively govern their colonies. More so, some of their colonies were vast, like Nigeria, like Sudan. So how could they impose an effective administration without the assistance of the local rulers? In 1900, only 42 administrators were availed by the Colonial Office in London for the administration of Nigeria. It could be impossible for them to effectively administer such colonies without the help of local rulers. There was language difficulties. Colonial officials did not understand African languages. And you know that Africa have got so many ethnicities or tribes. So it would be very hard for the British to understand all the language spoken by the Africans. It was now easy to use African local rulers to govern their subjects. Another one, the system was cheap. The British could use African chiefs to reduce the cost of running the colonies. The chiefs were paid lowly. They benefited much from the prestige which they had. They were satisfied with the prestige and British protection. Then, to avoid African resistances, indirect rule allowed some African chiefs to retain their powers and respected traditional institutions, and so won the hearts of Africans who saw the British as partners. When the Africans saw their fellow Africans giving them orders and their institutions not disturbed, then they saw the British not as enemies but as partners. They could now not resist. Physical difficulties. The British faced challenges with the environment of African colonies. They had little knowledge about the interior of Africa. Yet also, there were thick forests, tropical diseases, wild animals, and hostile tribes. This forced the British to use the local rulers who were familiar with their environment. It would be easy for the local rulers to entrench deeper into their localities than the British, who did not have the knowledge of the areas. To avoid direct confrontation with Africans, local rulers were shock absorbers of the colonial masters in case of attacks. The local rulers were a focus of attack always because they're the ones that directly reach to the colonial subjects. They served as intermediaries, receiving orders from the British, then reaching them down to their subjects. Now here, the British was protected. In case of an attack, it was the local ruler to be faced by his subjects, and not the British, who just gave orders. Then success of indirect rule in India. This one already seen in the introductory part of the indirect rule. The system was effective in their Indian colony. That's why they brought it to Africa. And we have said that India was a political laboratory, the colonial system. So when something has succeeded there, they transferred it to the colonies. Failure of the assimilation or direct rule systems. The British had tried assimilation in some of their foreign territories, like in Sierra Leone and the Gold Coast, now Ghana, but were frustrated by cultural resistance there. The colonized peoples in those colonies resisted the system to protect their culture. So the British saw it wise to use indirect rule. To get puppets, the use of traditional rulers could help the British get puppets, that is, agents that would implement colonial policies, that would serve even after the British had granted independence. They would remain serving them. How indirect rule was indirect? How did the policy of indirect rule implemented, and how was it successfully indirect? How did it show the indirect part in it? How was the theory put into practice of indirect rule? Local chiefs retained their position as long as they were seen willing to cooperate with the British. They retained their position, but with condition that they were seen willing to cooperate with the British. The use of local chiefs in the implementation of policies. We have seen that. They receive orders, put them down into practice. Then preservation of African tradition and culture that did not contradict with the British interests. The British did not interfere into the culture of the Africans. Africans retained their religion, their cultural practices, as long as they were not in contradiction. They did not block the British interests. Local chiefs collected taxes and were allowed to use part of it to meet the needs of the local administration. The local chiefs went down, collect taxes, retain part of the tax as their salaries, and to meet their costs, their local administrative costs. Then use of native rulers to handle traditional issues, African societies. And the British did not interfere with life, African life, religion, customs that did not contradict their interests. The local chiefs handled all the local courts were in the hands of the local chiefs. And all traditional cases, like marriage cases, land disputes, were in the hands of the British. The colonies were divided into divisions from provinces to villages for smooth administration. As we can see on the board here, you see this is the structure of administration and how it was handled. Policies were made in the colonial office in London, handled by the colonial secretary in Britain. The colonial secretary was the one in whose hand all the colonies were administered. Through him, orders were sent to all colonies. Then in the colony now, there was the governor. Each colony had a governor of its own. Under the governor, there was the Provincial Commissioners. Colonies means that were divided into provinces. Each province under a provincial commissioner, a white man. Then the provinces were divided into districts under district commissioners. This was also a European officer. Then there were district officers who worked under the district commissioners, also European officers. Then down here were the local chiefs. So the chiefs, then village headmen. These ones worked under the chiefs. Sometimes even the districts were divided into several parts. The districts were divided into counties. Then counties counties were divided into sub-counties. The sub-counties were divided into parishes. Then parishes were divided into, all these were parishes, were divided into sub-parishes, and sub-parishes were divided into villages. So the local chiefs was at the county level. So under him were subordinate African administrators to serve in the different sub-counties, different parishes, different sub-parishes, until down to the village headman. That is how it worked. It was a chain of command that orders came from the colonial office to the governor, descending down up to the village headman. How? Let us see. Were the theories of indirect rule implemented in full to see it indirect rule, or they had some elements of direct rule? Under the points we are going to look, we shall see that indirect rule also was a form of direct rule. Policies were designed in London, then brought to the colonies for implementation. It was a direct rule in that way. 2, policies and laws were made by the British and given to the local chiefs to implement. The local chiefs did not participate in decision making. He had to obey the orders given. The local chiefs who did not meet the requirements of the British were uncooperative or ineffective were replaced by the warrant or paramount chiefs that were British appointees. The British could remove a local chief if he did not please them and replace him with another chief or another African in his position. Some of the Africans even did not have, did not come from the ruling families. They were upstarts. They were upstarts. They did not have the ruling obligation. They did not come from the royal families of African societies. Another one is that all top positions such as governor, provincial, and the district commissioners were occupied by the British, not Africans. Then another, local chiefs could not use part of the taxes collected without permission of the British. He had no mandate of that. The system was exploited as it enforced cash crop production, forced labor, and other forms of exploitation. Effects of indirect rule. Negative. It created puppets of African chiefs, created social differences among Africans. The puppets, these are the people who tooth and nail serve the British to protect their positions. They fear to be removed, to be replaced. We have seen that those who did not perform were replaced. So these ones had to comply with the demands of the British and serve them as their puppets, as sycophants, bootlickers, you can say in another language. Then it created social divisions. The local chiefs and their families were exalted and given British favors. In the same way, where the system was more successful, the British tend to develop those areas than in areas where it did not work well. It built tribalism in African population because it was successful in some areas and it did not succeed in other areas. Like with northern Nigeria, among the Fulani and the Hausa, and the southern Nigeria, among the Igbo and the Yoruba mainly. Then it was a tool for transmission of English culture. Local chiefs are supposed to pretend to be British in culture, British in outlook, respect the terms of the British and their norms. Little respect was given to African chiefs. They were given less privileges and occupied lower positions. The positive effects maybe you can see the policy did not interfere with African institutions that did not interfere with the British interests. We have said a condition was there. If African institution or a local ruler did comply with the British demands, he retained his position. If he did not, then he was removed. it allowed traditional rulers to at least retain some powers. Those powers of collecting taxes then remain in their position being called chiefs, but with no real powers, but prestige of being called chief. They remain with such elementary things to keep them serving. Now we move, let us compare these two systems. We have looked at both, so we have to compare them. But before we compare, what can we relate indirect rule system to in present society? You know that it can be related to a democratic system of governance, where the head of the country, the head of a society, delegates some powers to those under him. And also there is respect of those the ruled people, maybe of the same thing of that kind. Similarities and differences between direct rule and indirect rule. Let us compare the two systems briefly. For both policies were made in the colonial offices in their metropolitan states. The Africans had no position in making decisions. Policies in both systems were directly formed by the British, by the Germans, by the Belgians, by the Portuguese from their colonial offices in their metropolitan states, and then brought to the colonies only for implementation. They were for the benefit of the colonial master through exploiting the colonies. I've said it in the beginning, and always remember, the interest of the colonial master was to serve the colonial master and not the colonized. Whatever he did was for his benefit, directly or indirectly. At present, or with immediate effect or future effect, but all what he did was for his own benefit. Both systems applied coercive apparatuses like police, army, and the prisons to suppress Africans who could resist colonial system. Yes, the British applied indirect rule, even in colonies where it succeeded, like in Uganda. But they suppressed the Kabarega, they suppressed the Mwanga resistances. The Germans did the same in their colonies. They suppressed, you know well, the history of the Majimaji rebellion, where they used too much force and brutal suppression of African resistance, killing thousands of people. The same did the British do when suppressing the Chimurenga resistance in Zimbabwe. Another one, both portrayed European superiority. All top positions were occupied by the Europeans. The African position was at the bottom to serve his immediate master, and that was the colonial officer. The African never was an African, even a district official. Their positions were to serve under the district officials as county chiefs, sub-county rulers, and as the ladder goes down. The system relied on the support of African chiefs who supervised colonial works in their local areas. We have seen that with the indirect rule. But even the direct rule system, we have examples. We have that the Germans, for example, used the Akidas and the Jumbes in Tanganyika. The same was applied in the other colonies. They could not rule or govern over the Africans without the assistance of the Africans. Both were oppressive. Colonial subjects were harassed to implement colonial policies like tax payment and provision. Here is where you have to remember that anything that served the British was retained. Anything that served the Germans, the Portuguese was retained. All those that did not serve their interests or blocked them to achieve their goals was not respected, was removed. The system did not respect traditional authorities. Some local rulers were removed and replaced by colonial appointees. We have seen the warrant chiefs or the paramount chiefs with the British. The Germans did the same. And Those maybe you can see, they can have more, but with respect of time, we cannot deal with everything in the few minutes given. Let us rush to the differences between direct rule and indirect rule. You can see the table there. On this side, we have elements concerning indirect rule, and here on the next column, we have elements concerning indirect rule. Indirect rule did not respect traditional institutions like customary courts and laws, so were replaced by the Europeans. For these ones, did not have any respect for traditional institutions or their systems of governance. Everything was scrapped off and replaced by the European system. For indirect rule, certain degree of respect, we are saying that it did not totally respect, but certain degree of respect was given when they did not contradict British interests. Local chiefs served as mere subordinates of the European officials. They were as good as slaves of the European officials. So they did not have any respect of a ruler or any respect of a leader to fellow Africans, but as a subordinate. The local chiefs on the other side serve as intermediaries. We have seen go between. Even in some local issues, the local chief could advise the British on what to do and he had the chance of being listened to because he was the one familiar with the environment of his locality. Another one, direct rule attracted more resistance due to extreme harsh treatment to the Africans. We have examples. We have given the example of the Majimaji in the German East Africa, the Nama Herero in the German Southwest Africa, now Namibia. We have many examples. But the British did not encounter so many resistances after 1914, or did not encounter so many resistances in their colonies compared to the Germans or the Belgians and the Portuguese in their colonies with a direct rule system. Indirect rule, however, did not. We have seen that. Direct rule system had higher administrative costs due to much employment of European officials. We have seen the European officials everywhere in all parts of administration. The local chief served at the real bottom, but with the indirect rule, we can see that some elements of power was given to many local rulers. So the British officers served in the colonies were fewer compared to the German or Portuguese or Belgian officers that serve in their colonies. Direct rule was characterized with racial superiority and despised African culture. The Germans, the Portuguese, the Belgians came to Africa with a belief that they have come for a civilization mission. So they exalted their position that they were nowhere level to the Africans. However, the British, on the other hand, did not so much interfere with African cultural practices. Direct rule was more rigid and brutal. We have seen this. The Germans and the Portuguese were more cruel to their colonial subjects. The same with the Belgians. We have examples that the Germans, the Portuguese used the most crude methods in the administration of their colonies. It was common for harder punishments to be administered on their colonial subjects. That included amputation, when maybe if a subject did not comply with the demands, they lost some of their limbs, maybe a hand or a leg being chopped off. Then in indirect rule, the British were less harsh due to partnership with African local rulers in their to handle their people's local affairs. They gave some respect to the local rulers. In some matters, the local rulers were always referred to in some traditional cases or issues that pertain their locality that the British saw they were so peculiar to a society and a reference had to be taken from the local ruler. Direct rule was more discriminative as Africans were denied rights such as education. Up to the time when the colonies where direct rule was used, like in the Belgian Congo, like in the Portuguese colonies of Angola, Mozambique, in most cases Africans were denied education. Let us take a reference. By 1960, there were only 17 graduates in the Belgian Congo. That country, you see, the biggest in Africa now, had only 17 graduates. Very little chances of education was given to the Africans. The same was done with the Portuguese, because they feared if Africans were given education, it would be easy for the Africans to overthrow their colonial masters, the Portuguese and the Belgians. We cannot say a lot about the Germans because they lost their colonies at the early part of the 19th century. That is in 1918, when after the First World War, when all of their colonies were handed over to the victor powers of the war. However, indirect rule allowed Africans more rights to access education. That system whereby the rulers established partnership with the Africans. Africans were allowed to start their own independent institutions, which included schools. So they were community schools. Let us see the reflective questions, which we had from the beginning. I'll just give, because we have looked at everything, we shall rush and go to the answers directly. Indirect rule and direct rule were the same system with different names. Substantiate this statement by giving 6 examples. For those who fear questions, might think that it is a very strange question. But when you look inside it with the keenness, you will discover that the question needs the similarities of indirect and direct rule. The answers of the question now here are. Here are the answers of the question. Indirect rule and direct rule were the same system with different names. Substantiate this statement by giving 6 examples. You give the similarities of the two systems. Both systems, the policies were designed from the metropolitan states. Both were oppressive. Both systems, the Europeans occupied top positions. They were for the benefit of the Europeans. They applied coercive apparatuses. Both portrayed European superiority. They did not respect traditional authorities, and so many others. Then with question 2, which says that indirect rule policy was truly indirect, justify the validity of this statement by giving 6 points. Is it strange? No, we have seen how the system was indirect. And how was indirect rule indirect? The answers are here. We have seen the local chiefs retaining their positions as long as, on condition they are not indifferent from the requirements of the British or their demands. The use of local chiefs in the implementation of policies, preservation of African tradition and culture that did not contradict the British interests. The local chiefs collected taxes and were allowed to retain part of the taxes. Use of native rulers to handle traditional issues of Africans. The British did not interfere with African life like religion. The colonies were divided into divisions from provinces to villages for smooth administration. So those are the requirements which we had to display for the subtopics of today, that is direct rule and indirect rule. Hope you can now be in position to understand the both systems and answer the questions that might be asked you, or you can also be in position to be helpful to others and explain to them, for those who did not watch me explaining these things, or do not have access to the media to acquire the knowledge which have been displayed to you. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much, and may God bless you as we have come to the conclusive part of the lesson today. God bless you and guide you through your preparation, and those who are seeking general knowledge also, may you have a deep understanding of these things. You might make more research for more and deeper understanding. Thank you very much. May God bless you.